you stubborn beast! You're ruining everything!
Whoa, it's moving!
Hey now, easy there!
Back up, back up!
Get to the side!
It's charging!
The day I woke up to fresh gravel cutting straight through my pasture, I thought it was a mistake. Bright signs, painted lines, and a smooth path ran right where my cattle grazed every morning. The HOA called it a community improvement. They said it was public now. What they ignored was the sound of hooves, the warning signs, and the fact that this land was never empty or harmless. Neighbors started riding through like nothing could go wrong. The HOA refused to stop, and that's when things turned dangerous, messy, and impossible to undo. What happens when rules on paper collide with reality on the ground? Before any lines were painted on the ground or any rules were waved in my face, life on the land was quiet in a way most people never get to experience. My days followed the same steady rhythm they had for years. Sunrise meant checking fences, walking the pasture, counting cattle, and making sure nothing had gone wrong overnight. Sunset meant the slow calm of animals settling down, the wind moving through grass, and the feeling that the land and I were in agreement about how things should be. This pasture wasn't a hobby or a weekend escape. It was working land. The cattle weren't decorations. They were large, stubborn, living animals that followed instincts, not signs or painted arrows. I had owned the land long before the neighborhood around it decided to grow outward. When I first bought it, there were no sidewalks, no community boards, no decorative entry signs. Just open space, fences, and dirt roads. Over time, houses appeared, then streets, then streetlights. Families moved in, and I didn't mind that part. I kept my fences maintained and my land marked. I respected boundaries, even when the city limits crept closer. For years, the arrangement worked. People knew where the pasture began and where their yards ended. Parents told their kids not to climb the fence. Walkers waved as they passed on the road. There was an unspoken understanding that this land had a purpose, and that purpose wasn't recreation. The HOA arrived later, quietly at first. It started with flyers in mailboxes and small meetings at the community center. Most of it seemed harmless. Lawn height rules, fence colors, trash bin schedules. None of it affected me much because my land wasn't part of the original development. It sat beside it, not inside it. Or at least, that's how I understood it. As years passed, the HOA grew more confident. Committees formed. Boards changed hands. The language in their notices became more polished and official. Words like community vision, shared spaces, and future planning started appearing. I noticed people walking closer to my fence line than before. Sometimes they'd stop and stare at the cattle, phones out, snapping pictures like they were at a petting zoo. It bothered me, but not enough to make a fuss. Curiosity wasn't a crime. The land itself was doing what it always had. Grass grew thick in spring. Mud formed near the low points after rain. The cattle followed familiar paths, wore down the same trails, and gathered near the water troughs. Anyone who knew livestock could see the signs instantly. This was active land. It wasn't flat, clean, or predictable. It shifted with weather and animals, and that was part of what made it work. I first sensed something changing when survey stakes appeared near the edge of the pasture. Thin wooden markers, barely noticeable unless you were looking for them. At first, I assumed the city was measuring utilities or checking drainage. That happened from time to time. No one had told me anything different. No letters, no phone calls, no notices posted. Then the foot traffic increased. Groups of neighbors walked along the fence line, stopping to talk, pointing at the stakes, gesturing toward the open field. I caught words drifting across the grass. Phrases about safety, access, and improvement. It all sounded vague, like people discussing a plan that wasn't finished yet. I checked my property records. Nothing had changed. The boundaries were the same as they had always been. I owned the pasture outright. There were no easements cutting through it. No shared access paths. No public right-of-way. Everything looked clean and clear. Still, the feeling that something was moving behind the scenes wouldn't go away. The HOA newsletter arrived one afternoon with a cheerful tone and a glossy cover. It talked about bringing neighbors together, promoting healthy lifestyles, and making the area more walkable. There was a small paragraph about a future multi-use path, but no map, no timeline, and no location listed. It sounded like a concept, not a plan. Life went on. I focused on work. The cattle needed attention, the fences needed repair after a storm, and the season was changing. I didn't attend HOA meetings because I wasn't required to. My land wasn't governed by their rules, or so I believed. I had no vote, no dues, no seat at their table. One morning, I noticed a section of fence had been flagged with bright tape. It wasn't damaged, just marked. The tape fluttered in the wind, impossible to ignore. Someone had crossed onto my property to put it there. That crossed a line, but I still assumed it was a mistake. Contractors were careless sometimes. I removed the tape and repaired the fence post it was tied to. The cattle barely noticed. They moved around it like they always did, heads down, focused on grass and routine. A few days later, the tape was back. This time there were more markers. And this time, there were tire tracks where there hadn't been any before. Deep, heavy tracks that cut through the soft ground. They weren't from my equipment. I knew every mark my own machinery left. These were different. That was the moment concern turned into something heavier. Not fear yet, but awareness. The kind that makes you pay closer attention. The kind that tells you someone else has plans that involve your land, whether you've agreed to them or not. I reached out to the HOA office, expecting a simple explanation. Something along the lines of a misunderstanding or miscommunication. I didn't accuse. I didn't threaten. I just asked what was going on near my fence line. The response was slow and vague. They thanked me for reaching out and said they were exploring options for community connectivity. They assured me no final decisions had been made. It was written in a tone that felt rehearsed, like it had been approved by a committee before being sent. In the following weeks, the signs became harder to ignore. Spray paint appeared on the ground near the pasture edge. Small dots and lines, bright against the dirt. Survey flags multiplied. Neighbors started talking openly about a bike path. They spoke like it was already happening, like it was inevitable. Some of them seemed excited. They talked about morning rides, kids biking safely to school, and property values going up. Others seemed unsure, glancing toward the cattle when they mentioned the path, lowering their voices as if acknowledging a problem they didn't want to deal with. I kept my distance, but I listened. And the more I listened, the clearer it became that my land was being discussed as if it were empty space, as if it were unused, as if the animals grazing there every day were invisible. The idea that someone could look at a working pasture and see only an opportunity was hard to accept. But that's exactly what was happening. The land was being reimagined without my involvement, rebranded as a corridor, a shortcut, a feature. I started documenting everything. Photos of the markers, records of communications, copies of my property deeds. It felt premature, but something told me it wouldn't stay simple for long. Power, once it decides it belongs somewhere, rarely asks permission twice. Through all of this, the cattle remained unaware. They followed the same paths, pushed against the same fence posts, and gathered in the same spots. They didn't understand lines on maps or plans in meetings. They only understood space, movement, and habit. That contrast stayed with me. On one side, polished language and optimistic promises. On the other, living animals and land shaped by years of use. It was clear which one would suffer if the wrong decision was made. The first piece of heavy equipment arrived early one morning. Not inside the pasture yet, but close enough to be seen and heard. The sound carried across the field, unfamiliar and unsettling. The cattle lifted their heads, alert, uneasy. No notice had been given. No agreement reached. And yet, things were already moving forward. That was when I realized this wasn't about a future idea anymore. The conflict wasn't coming. It had already begun. The next few weeks felt like watching a slow-moving storm roll in, the kind where the sky looks calm enough to ignore until the wind suddenly shifts. What had started as markers and machinery sounds quickly turned into official-looking notices taped to posts near my fence line. They weren't addressed to me directly. They were labeled as community updates, printed with the HOA logo, and written in language that carefully avoided naming any specific property owner. The message was always the same. Progress was underway. Construction crews began showing up more frequently. Trucks parked along the road. Workers walked the perimeter, stepping closer and closer to the pasture as if testing how far they could go before someone stopped them. Every day brought a new change. A patch of grass flattened. Another fence post brushed aside. It wasn't dramatic at first, but it was relentless. Then came the first letter with my name on it. It claimed I was in violation of HOA standards for obstructing a planned community amenity. According to them, Temporary fencing, warning signs, and livestock presence near a shared-use corridor posed a safety concern. They demanded I remove anything that interfered with access. They included a deadline. They also included a fine schedule. The absurdity of it hit hard. I wasn't blocking their project. Their project was cutting through my land. The cattle weren't an obstacle I had placed there. They were the reason the land existed as it did. Still, the letter read like a final warning, not a discussion. I responded with documentation. Deeds, maps, photos, proof that the pasture wasn't under HOA authority and never had been. I expected pushback, but I didn't expect silence. Days passed with no reply, while activity on the ground increased. The first actual damage happened overnight. A section of fencing had been removed, not broken or vandalized, but cleanly taken down. The posts were stacked neatly to the side like someone had decided they no longer belonged there. By morning, the cattle had already noticed the opening. They clustered near it, confused by the sudden change in boundaries they had followed for years. I fixed it immediately, reinforcing the area and adding clearer warning signs. Large ones. Impossible to miss. They stated plainly that the land was private, active cattle pasture, and not safe for public access. By afternoon, the HOA sent another notice. This one accused me of installing unauthorized signage that created a hostile environment for residents. The fines doubled. Neighbors started showing up at the fence line more often. Some out of curiosity, some out of concern, a few out of entitlement. Cyclists tested the edges of the pasture, riding close enough to spook the cattle. Parents walked with children, pointing, as if this was already a park. Each interaction added to the pressure, even when no words were exchanged. The HOA escalated fast. They claimed the path fell under a newly approved easement tied to community health initiatives. The language was dense, filled with references to internal votes and planning committees I had never been part of. They sent copies to the city, framing the situation as a cooperative effort stalled by a non-compliant landowner. Soon after, city inspectors appeared. They weren't hostile, but they were cautious. They walked the pasture edge, took notes, and asked questions about fencing and livestock containment. Every question felt like a test. Every answer felt like it could be twisted later. The fines kept coming. Weekly, then daily, each one larger than the last. The amounts were designed to overwhelm, not correct. It was pressure disguised as procedure. Sleep became difficult. Every unfamiliar sound at night made me wonder if more fencing would be gone by morning. I started checking the pasture earlier each day, scanning for changes before the cattle could wander into danger. The animals sensed the tension. They were restless, easily startled by the increasing noise and movement around them. The HOA's next move was bold. They sent out a community-wide announcement celebrating the near completion of the bike path. They included a map. The line cut straight through the center of my pasture. Seeing it laid out so casually made something snap. This wasn't confusion or overreach anymore. It was erasure. My land had been reduced to a blank space between 2 points on a glossy flyer. Construction began in earnest the following week. Gravel trucks dumped loads just inside the fence line. Workers spread it quickly, creating a visible strip of change through land that had never been leveled for human convenience. The cattle avoided the area at first, unsure of the new texture underfoot. Then one wandered too close, slipped slightly, and bolted, setting the rest into motion. That moment made everything real. Animals running in panic don't follow logic. They scatter. They push. They break things. I spent hours calming them, repairing damage, and trying to restore order to a space that no longer made sense to them. I contacted the HOA again, this time demanding an immediate stop. Their response was curt. They claimed I was exaggerating risks and refusing to adapt to community growth. They reminded me that continued obstruction would result in legal action. The harassment expanded beyond letters. Complaints were filed against me for noise, despite the cattle having been there for years. Accusations of neglect followed, based on anonymous reports. Each one required time, energy, and proof to address. Each one chipped away at patience and resources. Meanwhile, the path grew longer, wider, more defined. Cyclists began using completed sections even as construction continued. Some slowed when they saw the cattle. Others didn't. Near misses became common. A bike skidding in mud. A startled animal turning sharply. Every incident felt like a countdown to something worse. I installed additional barriers, temporary but sturdy. The HOA removed them within days, citing interference with public access. They didn't notify me. They didn't ask. They simply acted. The sense of helplessness was suffocating. Every attempt to protect my land was reframed as aggression. Every boundary was treated as negotiable. The rules seemed to change depending on who benefited. Support came quietly. A few neighbors stopped by, shaking their heads, admitting the project had gone too far. Others warned me that the HOA was determined to make an example out of anyone who resisted. Progress needed resistance to look unreasonable, they said. And I was it. The tipping point came when a cyclist fell inside the pasture. No serious injury, but serious enough to bring emergency vehicles. The cattle had scattered. The scene was chaos. And before the dust settled, the HOA seized the moment. They blamed the incident on my refusal to remove livestock from the path area. They framed it as proof that the land was unsafe for animals, not for people. That night, another letter arrived. This one wasn't about fines. It was about liability. They claimed continued presence of cattle near the path exposed the community to unacceptable risk. They demanded immediate compliance or threatened court action. Standing in the pasture under fading light, surrounded by animals that depended entirely on boundaries I could no longer enforce, the situation felt unbearable. The path was no longer just a strip of gravel. It was a line drawn straight through my life, daring me to cross it. And just when it seemed like the pressure couldn't increase any further, a notice appeared announcing a public ribbon-cutting event scheduled right on the pasture. The ribbon-cutting announcement changed everything. Until that moment, the fight had lived in letters, fines, and quiet destruction done in daylight while pretending nothing was wrong. But a public event meant witnesses. It meant cameras, speeches, and carefully rehearsed smiles. It meant the HOA was confident enough to celebrate before the conflict was resolved. And that confidence was exactly what made the next steps unavoidable. The days leading up to the event were the heaviest I had felt since this began. Construction crews worked non-stop, widening the path and smoothing it into something unmistakably permanent. Gravel was compacted. Edges were shaped. Painted markers appeared, guiding people straight through land that was still, legally and physically, an active cattle pasture. The cattle avoided the area entirely now, bunching together in the remaining space, unsettled by the constant movement and noise. The HOA framed the event as a victory lap. Flyers went out promising a new era of community connection. Local officials were invited. Social media posts praised the board for their persistence in the face of unreasonable resistance. The narrative had been set, and I was cast as the obstacle standing in the way of progress. What they didn't know was that I had stopped, reacting, and started preparing. Every document, every survey marker, every unauthorized removal of fencing had been logged. I had obtained copies of city planning records showing no approved easement through my land. I had records showing the HOA's internal vote never included the legal landowner. I had veterinary statements explaining the danger of mixing livestock with recreational traffic. And most importantly, I had confirmation that the HOA's insurance explicitly excluded coverage for incidents involving agricultural land they did not own. The morning of the ribbon cutting arrived clear and bright, the kind of day chosen on purpose for photos. Cars lined the road. Folding tables were set up. A temporary banner stretched across the path, planted directly where cattle had grazed only weeks earlier. HOA board members moved around confidently, greeting guests like hosts at a grand opening. I stood at the fence line, watching it all unfold. The cattle were restless behind me, sensing the unfamiliar crowd. Their weight shifted in the grass, hooves pressing into ground that no longer felt secure. The contrast was sharp. Celebration on one side, tension on the other. As the crowd gathered, cyclists began rolling through even before the ceremony officially started. Some slowed, noticing the animals. Others didn't. One sudden movement from the herd caused a ripple of alarm through the group. It was brief, but it was enough to remind anyone paying attention that this wasn't a park. It was a working pasture barely being held back by temporary barriers. The ceremony began anyway. Speeches praised vision and perseverance. The path was described as safe, inclusive, and thoughtfully planned. Each word felt heavier than the last, because every sentence ignored reality. Cameras pointed toward smiling faces. Applause followed each mention of community growth. Then the moment came that no one expected. A city official stepped forward, documents in hand, intending to make a routine acknowledgement. Instead, the tone shifted. The official referenced outstanding land use concerns, mentioned unresolved ownership disputes, noted that the path crossed private agricultural land without a recorded easement. The air changed instantly. Murmurs spread through the crowd. HOA board members stiffened. Cameras hesitated, unsure where to point. The official continued, explaining that multiple complaints and documented risks had triggered a last-minute review. That review had uncovered serious procedural failures. At that point, the confidence drained from the event like water through cracked concrete. The official stated that until the matter was resolved, the city could not recognize the path as a public amenity. Any injuries occurring there would not be covered by municipal insurance. Responsibility would fall entirely on the entity that authorized construction. The entity, of course, was the HOA. The realization hit in waves. First confusion, then panic. Board members whispered urgently to one another. Phones came out. The banner fluttered in the wind, suddenly looking less like a symbol of pride and more like a warning sign. What followed was chaos disguised as damage control. The HOA attempted to spin the situation, insisting it was a minor administrative delay. But the crowd could feel the shift. Parents pulled children closer. Cyclists dismounted. A few neighbors glanced toward the cattle again, this time with concern instead of curiosity. Then the second blow landed. A legal notice was served on the spot. It outlined potential liability for unauthorized land use, animal endangerment, and negligence. It referenced the recent cyclist incident, clearly stating that continued operation of the path placed the HOA at risk of significant legal exposure. The silence that followed was louder than any argument could have been. The board members who had once sent fines and threats now looked small, trapped by their own momentum. Their authority relied on the assumption that no one would challenge them publicly. That assumption had just collapsed in front of an audience. The crowd dispersed quickly after that. No ribbon was cut. No photos were taken. The celebration dissolved into awkward conversations and hurried exits. What was meant to be a public triumph became a very visible failure. But the climax wasn't over yet. That afternoon, construction crews returned, not to continue work, but to undo it. Temporary barriers were reinforced. Warning signs were reinstalled, this time with city approval. The path was closed, pending review. Cyclists were turned away. The gravel strip that had cut through the pasture now sat unused, a scar with no purpose. The cattle slowly reclaimed the space, stepping cautiously at first, then more confidently as the noise faded. The land began to feel like itself again, even if it would never fully be the same. The HOA's response came later that evening in the form of a mass email. It attempted to downplay the situation, framing the closure as a collaborative pause. But the language was defensive now. Careful. Afraid. Behind the scenes, the pressure reversed direction. Insurance providers demanded explanations. Legal counsel advised retreat. Board members faced questions from residents who hadn't realized the risks until they were spelled out publicly. The power dynamic had flipped. For weeks, I had been reacting, protecting, documenting. Now the HOA was scrambling, forced to justify actions they had once treated as unquestionable. Their rules, their fines, their authority suddenly required validation. And that validation was nowhere to be found. Standing at the edge of the pasture that evening, watching the cattle settle back into familiar patterns, the weight lifted just enough to breathe. The fight wasn't finished, but the peak had passed. The moment they tried to turn private land into a stage had exposed everything they hoped would stay hidden. They had counted on silence. They had relied on momentum. They had assumed resistance would fold under pressure. Instead, their own confidence had led them into the light. And what came next would determine whether this ended quietly or changed everything for good. The days after the failed ribbon cutting felt strangely quiet, like the calm after something breaks that can never be fully repaired. The machinery was gone. The crowds were gone. Even the HOA emails slowed, their confident tone replaced by careful, non-committal language that said very little while admitting more than they realized. For the first time since this began, the land was allowed to breathe. The city moved faster than expected. What had once felt like an endless waiting game suddenly shifted into motion. Inspectors returned, this time with purpose. They documented everything the HOA had ignored before. the lack of a legal easement, the risk posed to livestock, the environmental impact of altering working pasture land without approval. Each visit reinforced what I had known all along, that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a gray area, but a clear case of authority being stretched until it snapped. Within weeks, an official order was issued. The bike path could not reopen in its current location. Any future proposal would require a full land use review, consent from the landowner, and safety measures that made coexistence with livestock realistic. In other words, the project as envisioned was dead. The HOA tried to save face. They released statements emphasizing their commitment to community values and cooperation. They claimed lessons had been learned. But behind the scenes, the consequences were already unfolding. Legal fees mounted. Insurance premiums spiked. Board members who had pushed hardest for the path quietly stepped down, citing personal reasons. Elections were called earlier than scheduled. Residents began asking questions that hadn't been asked before about transparency, authority, and where the line between community and control should be drawn. For me, the outcome was tangible. The damaged sections of pasture were restored at the HOA's expense, ordered as part of the resolution. Fencing was rebuilt properly, stronger than before. Clear boundaries were established and recorded, not just on paper, but physically on the land. Signs went up with city backing, leaving no room for interpretation. This was private, active cattle land. Not a shortcut, not an amenity, not negotiable. The cattle adjusted faster than I expected. Animals are good at reclaiming space when given the chance. Within days, they were grazing across areas that had been churned up by gravel and boots. Within weeks, the worn strip began to soften under hooves and grass. It wouldn't ever be exactly what it was, but it was close enough to remind me why I had fought so hard to protect it. Neighbors changed too. Some apologized quietly, admitting they hadn't understood the situation until it became public. Others avoided the fence line altogether, embarrassed by how easily they had accepted the HOA's version of events. A few remained resentful, still clinging to the idea that progress had been stolen from them. But their voices were smaller now, drowned out by caution and memory. The HOA itself became more careful, almost timid. New projects were announced with detailed explanations and clear opt-outs. Meetings became longer, more tense, filled with residents who had learned that asking questions mattered. The board no longer assumed compliance. They sought it. What struck me most was how quickly power lost its grip once it was challenged in the open. For months, the HOA had relied on pressure applied in isolation. Letters, fines, threats delivered privately, one person at a time. That method worked because it kept conflict contained. The moment everything was exposed to daylight, the illusion collapsed. Authority that can't withstand scrutiny isn't authority at all. It's just momentum. There were personal costs, of course. The stress didn't vanish overnight. The land would always carry reminders of what happened. And trust, once shaken, doesn't rebuild easily. But there was also something gained that went beyond fences or fines. I learned how quickly normal life can be disrupted when someone decides your space exists for their convenience. How easily rules meant for shared living can turn into weapons when empathy is removed. And how dangerous it is when people stop seeing land, animals, or even neighbors as real, and start seeing them as obstacles. The story spread beyond the neighborhood. Other landowners reached out, sharing similar experiences. Some had folded under pressure. Others were still fighting. They all said the same thing. Watching someone push back and win made them feel less alone. It reminded them that compliance isn't the same as obligation. That, more than anything, became the lasting impact. The bike path was eventually rerouted along public land where it belonged. It took longer and cost more, but it was built properly, with clear safety measures and legal approvals. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. What could have been done right from the start became a lesson in what happens when shortcuts are taken at someone else's expense. Standing in the pasture one evening, watching the cattle settle as the light faded, the land felt quiet again. Not empty, but steady, grounded. It reminded me that not everything valuable needs to be shared, optimized, or improved. Some things exist because they work as they are. The HOA never admitted fault outright. They didn't have to. Their silence, their retreat, and the changes that followed said enough. Power doesn't like to confess. It prefers to move on and hope people forget. But the land remembers. And so do the people who learned, the hard way, that not all paths are meant to be built, and not every line on a map gives you the right to cross someone else's life. If there's one takeaway that lingers, it's this: when authority ignores reality long enough, reality eventually answers back. The question is whether you stay silent and let it happen, or stand your ground before the damage becomes irreversible.